when a trembling 10-year-old girl burst through the front door of Ted Porter's Cozy Corner shop. He almost waved it off as a simple case of a lost child seeking attention. But the sheer terror in her eyes and the way her little fingers clutched at the fabric of her sweater changed everything in an instant, unraveling a chain of events that no one in the quiet town of Brookhaven could have foreseen. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of compassion, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Ted had been sorting through a new shipment of teas that afternoon, humming softly under his breath in the lull of another uneventful day. His shop was a quaint place with warm-colored wooden shelves stocked meticulously with jars of homemade jams, loose-leaf tea canisters, small craft goods, and an old cash register that chimed pleasantly whenever he opened it. Sunlight streamed in through the large glass windows, illuminating specks of dust floating lazily in the air. It was early spring, and the scent of freshly brewed tea mixed with the crisp smell of the outdoors whenever he propped the shop door open for a breeze. He turned around at the sound of the door squeaking open, expecting to see one of his regular customers, maybe Mrs. Pembroke, who always came in for shortbread cookies, or Mr. Archer, who needed his weekly bag of spiced rooibos. Instead, there stood a small girl, pale as a sheet, hair disheveled and cheeks tear-streaked. She hesitated in the doorway as if bracing for someone to yank her back at any second. "Are you all right, dear?" Ted asked, gently setting down the box he held. He noticed the tremor in her voice as she opened her mouth to speak. Though quiet and timid by nature, Ted possessed a keen sense of empathy, sharpened by years of listening more than talking. Something about the girl's urgency tugged at him, compelling him to look closer. "Please, help me," she whispered. "My name is Emily. I don't know where else to go." She glanced over her shoulder, as if fearful someone might be following her. Ted came around the counter slowly, not wanting to startle her. He knelt to bring himself to her eye level. Her hair, dark blonde, hung in messy strands around her face. Ted could see bruises on her arms, faded purple and fresh, angry blue blotches. Instantly, alarm bells went off in his mind, stirring up memories of distant family troubles he had once witnessed in his own past, though rarely spoken of. He kept his voice steady. "Emily, what happened? Are you hurt?" Her chest rose and fell in stuttered breath. My father, he's not a good man. He does things to me, and he did something terrible to my mom." Her eyes welled with fresh tears as she struggled to say the words. "I think he killed her. Please, please don't let him find me." For a frozen second, Ted felt the air thicken around him. He had heard rumors, whispers from neighbors about troubled homes in distant corners of Brookhaven, but never had he been confronted so directly with such a desperate plea. He swallowed, trying to compose himself, and gently took Emily's hand. "Come," he said, leading her to a small stool by the counter. "You're safe here." He grabbed his phone, intending to call the police. But before he dialed, he noticed Emily's wide, frightened stare. She looked like a cornered animal that might bolt if spooked. Something in him decided to wait, to make sure she knew she could trust him before he introduced any more uniformed strangers into her life. Setting his phone aside for the moment, he draped a light blanket around her trembling shoulders. "Tell me what happened, Emily," Ted said. He offered her a tissue from the counter. She clutched it in her small hands. "Whenever you're ready." She drew a shaking breath, eyes filled with tears that reflected a story far too heavy for someone her age. "My father's name is Greg Dawson. He's angry all the time. He hits me and he yells a lot. But he would get worse with my mom, Rachel. She tried to protect me. Then one day Mom disappeared. He said she ran away. I heard him on the phone telling someone he'd taken care of her. I don't think she ran away. I think he hurt her. I think he killed her." Ted could scarcely breathe. The raw honesty in her voice, the undisguised fear, wrapped around his heart like a vice. "Emily," he said gently, "I'm so sorry." She brushed tears from her cheeks, trying to steady herself. "I've been hiding from him every night, locking myself in my room, waiting until he passes out from drinking. I heard him talking to a friend last week about debts, about money. I'm scared he might do something else." Ted's mind whirled. Brookhaven was a small town. It had its share of ordinary troubles, but hearing a 10-year-old girl speak so calmly about murder tore at him. "I'll help you," he managed, his voice unwavering in determination. "First, I need to make sure you're safe." He gently offered her a cup of warm tea, the mildest variety he had, sweetening it with a drop of honey. She sipped it, wincing when it touched a split on her lip Ted hadn't noticed until then. In that moment, Ted understood there was no dismissing her story. This was not a matter of a child's misunderstanding or exaggeration. This was terror, real and immediate. Summoning the courage that had so often failed him in his own life, Ted put a hand on her shoulder. "Emily, do you go to school here in Brookhaven?" She nodded, gaze dropping to the floor. "Yes. Maplewood Elementary." Ted exhaled a long breath. "All right. There's someone at your school who might be able to help. Mrs. Lawson, right? She's the nurse there. We could talk to her." Emily nodded. "She's always nice to me," she whispered. "She doesn't know everything, but she noticed the bruises once. I told her it was an accident." "Will you trust me?" Ted asked, heart pounding. "We need to tell her what you just told me. We need the police to know, too. They'll help us find out what happened to your mom." He paused, searching her face. "Is that all right?" She trembled, but managed a small nod. "I'm just scared of what he'll do if he finds out I told." Ted set his jaw. "He won't hurt you anymore, Emily. I promise." Before leaving the store, Ted locked up early. It was something he rarely did. His shop was his livelihood, but the urgency in Emily's situation shattered routine. He scribbled a quick note to any potential customers. "Closed for family emergency. Back tomorrow." He guided Emily to his old, rust-speckled sedan parked behind the shop. The car had seen better days, but it was reliable enough to get them across town to Maplewood Elementary. All the while, Emily held his hand. She hardly spoke on the drive, and Ted didn't push her. His own nerves prickled. He was no hero, just a solitary shopkeeper who preferred the company of quiet mornings to the hum of social gatherings. But now, he was all this girl had, at least until he could hand her over to professionals who knew how to handle the nightmares she was living. When they arrived at the school, the familiar squeak of the old front doors nearly made Emily jump. Afternoon classes were still in session, hallways mostly empty except for a passing custodian who gave them a polite nod. They headed to the nurse's office near the end of the main corridor, each step echoing on polished floors. Mrs. Lawson was a kindly woman in her late 40s, with short, curly hair, round glasses, and an expression that could only be described as motherly concern. She blinked in surprise at seeing Emily and Ted appear unannounced. "Emily," she exclaimed, stepping forward from behind her small desk. "Are you feeling unwell, sweetheart?" Ted gently nudged Emily forward, encouraging her to speak. With trembling lips, Emily began again, telling Mrs. Lawson what she had told Ted. The more she spoke, the more color drained from Mrs. Lawson's face. By the end, the nurse stood rigid, her eyes full of sorrow and outrage. "I knew something was off," Mrs. Lawson murmured, her voice breaking slightly. "I saw bruises, but you insisted they came from playground accidents. My God, Emily, I'm so sorry I didn't do more sooner." Emily's voice wavered. "It's okay. I'm sorry I didn't tell you." Mrs. Lawson knelt and placed gentle hands on the girl's shoulders. "You did nothing wrong. This is not your fault." Then she looked at Ted. "We have to call Child Protective Services and the police immediately. You were right to bring her here." Ted nodded, relieved that someone with authority was taking the reins. Despite his private fears, he felt a spark of gratitude that a child like Emily would finally get the help she deserved. Within half an hour, 2 uniformed officers arrived. One was Officer Elena Morales, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 30s, and the other was her partner, Officer Pete Sullivan, a sturdy man with a kind expression. They listened attentively while Emily repeated her account. Then they took separate statements from Ted and Mrs. Lawson. Officer Morales crouched to address Emily gently. "We're going to make sure you're safe, all right? We'll get Child Protective Services involved, and you'll have a temporary place to stay where your father can't get near you." She paused, glancing at Ted. "Thank you for helping her. Emily, is there anything else you can think of?" Emily's small voice carried a trembling note of desperation. "He hurt my mom," she said. "I know he did. Can you find her? I want to know." Tears threatened to overwhelm the girl again. Mrs. Lawson wrapped an arm around her while Officer Sullivan nodded. "We're treating your mom's disappearance as a high priority. We'll do our best." Child Protective Services arrived not long after, and though Emily clung to Ted for a moment, she allowed herself to be led to a waiting car, her eyes brimming with apprehension. Ted's heart twisted, seeing the panic in her, but he knew this was the right thing to do. He stepped forward and gave her a small wave goodbye, not sure if or when he'd see her again. Emily waved back, tears shimmering on her cheeks, but also a flicker of relief that, at least for the moment, she was out of danger. That evening, after the adrenaline had cooled, Ted returned to his little apartment above the shop. He felt a hollow weight in his chest. The police had taken his statement, ensuring they had every detail. Emily's exact words, how she looked, the bruises she bore. They asked him questions about her father, Greg Dawson, but Ted only knew him in the vaguest sense. He recognized Greg's name from rumors around town, but had never crossed paths directly. Ted tried to busy himself with small tasks, organizing receipts, preparing new inventory lists, but his mind kept drifting back to Emily's haunted expression. He pictured her now in some unfamiliar foster home, probably lying awake in bed, frightened of shadows. He stared out the window at the silent Brookhaven streetlights, feeling a pang of guilt that he hadn't done more, that he hadn't recognized the signs in the days or weeks before this, though truly, how could he have known? He made a simple dinner of roasted vegetables and rice, but his appetite was nearly non-existent. He pushed his plate aside and sank into the worn armchair by his living room window. Moonlight fell across the modest furnishings, an old bookshelf filled with dog-eared novels, a single potted plant that he struggled to keep alive. It felt wrong to be so comfortable when Emily's life had been torn to pieces. He'd always considered himself a decent person, yet in that moment, he wondered if decency was enough. Outside, a car rumbled past, headlights slicing through the darkness. Ted closed his eyes, remembering the terror in Emily's voice. "He killed her. He killed my mom." Those words echoed in his mind. Quiet though he was, Ted had never shied away from doing the right thing. Growing up with stern, uncompromising parents, he learned to keep his head down, to cause no trouble. But some troubles, he now realized, had to be faced. If he had turned his back on Emily, where would she be tonight? The thought was too terrible to bear. Eventually, exhaustion won. He drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with nightmares, fleeting images of a little girl pleading in a dark hallway, a looming shadowy figure, and a door that slammed shut before he could reach her. He woke in a cold sweat, heart pounding, as the night stretched on. Morning light found Brookhaven calm, as it always did, with the sun's first rays peeking over the rooflines of the small downtown. Ted opened his shop at 9, the usual hour, forcing himself to return to normalcy. But nothing felt normal anymore. Customers came and went. Some browsed the shelves, commented on the early spring blossoms visible outside, or inquired about fresh bread from the nearby bakery. Ted offered polite smiles, rung up purchases, and tried not to let his turmoil show. He listened for any hint, any rumor, of what might be happening with Greg Dawson, but people rarely spoke the name. It was as if the town was oblivious. The police likely kept details under wraps for the time being. That afternoon, Officer Morales stopped by unannounced. Ted nearly jumped when he saw her step into the shop. She removed her sunglasses, revealing tired eyes. "Ted," she said, in a friendly but solemn tone. Can we talk? Of course, Ted replied, leading her aside so they wouldn't be overheard by the handful of browsing patrons. Is Emily all right? She's safe, Officer Morales said. She glanced around at the displays of jams and teas. She's in temporary foster care for now. But the situation with her father is escalating. Greg Dawson's missing? Ted felt a jolt in his stomach. Missing how? He's on the run, Officer Morales explained softly. The moment we started asking around, we got wind that he'd left town. His landlord said Greg packed up late last night, took some belongings, and vanished. We have reason to believe he might have realized the police were closing in. We have an APB out for him, but so far no sign. Ted's lips tightened into a grim line. What about Emily's mother? Officer Morales sighed. Still no confirmation on her whereabouts. We're considering the possibility she's deceased. We haven't found a body, but we've got a few leads. If Greg's involved, he might have done something drastic to hide any evidence. A chill coursed through Ted. What do I do? He asked quietly, feeling almost helpless. Is there anything else I can? Just keep your ears open, Morales replied. You were the one she trusted. If Greg returns to town, there's a chance he might try to track down anyone who helped Emily. That could include you. Ted swallowed. I understand. Morales reached into her pocket and handed him a business card. Call me if you see anything or if you're concerned for your own safety, all right? He nodded. Once she left, Ted stared at the card, feeling the weight of the situation more than ever. The notion that Greg might come after him felt surreal, but the fear in Emily's eyes replayed in his mind, a reminder that anything was possible. In the following days, Brookhaven buzzed with quiet rumors. People whispered about a missing mother, a child taken into protective custody, and a father fleeing the law. Yet the details seemed murky, and no official statement had been released. Ted found himself glancing over his shoulder whenever he closed shop at night. He double-checked the locks on both the store's entrance and the stairwell leading to his apartment. Sleep came fitfully, if at all. During this time, Ted received a call from a social worker named Carla Perez. She introduced herself politely, explaining that she was the caseworker assigned to Emily. She's doing okay, Carla reassured him. Under the circumstances, she's handling it as well as can be expected. She's in a good foster home, a married couple with no children, experienced in caring for kids in crisis. Relief swept through Ted. That's good to hear, he said. Then, after a moment, please let her know I'm thinking about her. I don't want to intrude, but if she ever needs anything, or if she wants to talk, I'd be happy to help. Carla's voice warmed. Thank you, Mr. Porter. She mentioned you, actually, said you were very kind. Once we get a better sense of her situation, we might arrange a visit if it's in her best interest. Right now, there's just a lot of uncertainty with the ongoing investigation. Ted understood. Emily needed stability, and the last thing he wanted was to disrupt her life. Still, he couldn't help but long to see her, to be certain she was truly safe. Weeks passed in a slow churn of anxiety for Ted and a flurry of investigative steps for the authorities. Word eventually broke that a set of remains, believed to be Rachel Dawson, were discovered in a shallow grave off a wooded back road. Dental records confirmed it, sending a wave of horror through the community. The local paper ran a discreet headline about a potential homicide tied to a missing mother. Though the article was cautious and lacking in details, everyone in Brookhaven was talking about it in hushed tones. The minute Ted read the news, he felt physically sick. He closed his shop early that day, the memory of Emily's tearful confession echoing. I think he killed her. She had been right all along, and now, her worst suspicions were laid bare. There was no chance of a miracle, no hope that Rachel had run away to start a new life somewhere. Instead, her life had been stolen, leaving a trail of heartbreak behind. Greg Dawson became the prime suspect in the homicide investigation. The manhunt intensified. Posters bearing his face circulated online and around neighboring towns. Ted kept glancing at them, memorizing the lines of Greg's features. A tall man, early 40s, dark hair, lean build, a scowl etched across the photograph. Ted couldn't shake the image as he locked his doors each night, paranoia gnawing at the corners of his mind. At last, the break came nearly 3 months after Emily first stepped into Ted's shop. Greg was found hiding out in a motel 3 states away, using a false name. His capture made local and regional headlines. Fugitive suspected of murder apprehended, read one. When Ted caught wind of it, he breathed a sigh of relief so deep it left him weak in the knees. For the first time, he believed Emily was truly safe. That night, he slept better than he had in months. The months that followed were a slow climb toward justice. Greg Dawson was extradited back to Brookhaven to face charges. Emily, meanwhile, endured a complicated legal process. The district attorney's office needed her testimony to strengthen the case, but every time she had to speak of her father's brutality or her mother's disappearance, it reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. Ted remained on the periphery of these events, but occasionally, Carla Perez updated him. "Emily is doing as well as can be expected," she said once. "Therapy sessions, a stable foster placement, and a strong support network. These are helping her cope." Eventually, Greg's trial came. The evidence was damning. Physical evidence linking him to the burial site, phone records, witness statements. Emily, under the gentle guidance of a child psychologist, gave a statement via video to avoid the trauma of facing her father in court. The trial was short, the conviction swift. Greg Dawson was found guilty of second-degree murder, along with multiple counts of child abuse, receiving a sentence that virtually assured he would spend decades behind bars. The day the verdict came in, Ted quietly celebrated in his own way, closing his eyes behind the shop counter, exhaling relief that Emily's abuser would no longer cast a shadow over her life. And so life went on. Emily moved from her temporary foster home to a permanent one, a nurturing couple named the Whitfields who had a large, cozy house just outside Brookhaven's main residential area. She settled into a new routine, adjusting to a life free of nightly terror. She went to therapy sessions, joined an art club at school, and learned to channel her turbulent emotions into painting. Sometimes, Carla Perez would mention how Emily's artwork reflected her journey from fear to cautious hope. Over time, Emily began to speak more about wanting to see Ted again. "She's asked about you," Carla told him over the phone. "She'd like to say thank you, maybe catch up. Would you be open to that?" Ted felt a lump in his throat. "Absolutely," he replied. "Whenever is best for her." A meeting was arranged one sunny Saturday. Emily was accompanied by Carla and one of her new foster parents, Susan Whitfield. They chose a small cafe near the center of Brookhaven, a neutral spot where Emily could feel safe. Ted arrived early, perched on a bench outside, trying to quell the nervous flutter in his stomach. When he spotted Emily walking down the sidewalk with Carla and Susan, he stood and gave a little wave. Emily looked taller, as if those few months had stretched her limbs. She wore her hair back in a neat ponytail, and though her expression was reserved, her eyes brightened when she saw him. She broke into a half-run, not quite sure if it was okay to show too much excitement. Ted dropped to one knee to meet her embrace. "Hi, Mr. Porter," she said softly, her voice slightly muffled by the fabric of his shirt as she hugged him. He hugged her gently back. "Hi, Emily. I'm so happy to see you." Then he pulled away enough to study her face. He noticed she looked healthier, a bit of color on her cheek. "How are you?" She shrugged shyly, glancing over at Susan and Carla. "I'm okay. It's better now. I have my own room, and the Whitfields are really nice. And I'm not scared all the time anymore." A flicker of sadness crossed her eyes. "I miss my mom. But I'm okay." Ted reached out and squeezed her hand. "I'm glad." Inside the cafe, they all sat together, sipping lemonade and nibbling on pastries. Susan was a warm, kind woman in her early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a ready smile. Carla acted as a gentle mediator, stepping in if the conversation drifted anywhere uncomfortable. But mostly, Emily and Ted talked about small things. School, her art, how the shop was doing. Ted listened with quiet admiration as she described a painting she was working on. "It's a field of sunflowers," she said, eyes lighting up. "The middle sunflower is holding a paintbrush. It sounds silly, but in my head, it's like the sunflower is painting over the darkness." Ted smiled, imagining it vividly. "That's not silly at all, Emily. It sounds like a wonderful way to let your feelings out." Susan nodded in agreement. "She's quite talented. We bought her an easel, and every chance she gets, she's in her room painting something new." Emily beamed at that praise, then turned back to Ted. "I'm still afraid sometimes," she admitted, voice dropping. "I know he's in jail, but it's like, what if he gets out?" Ted felt a pang in his chest. "He won't be out for a long time, Emily. You're safe?" She took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "I know. Thank you, Mr. Porter, for helping me that day. And for believing me." He shook his head, tears threatening to surface. "You never have to thank me for that. I'm just so sorry for everything you went through." They parted ways that afternoon with plans to keep in touch. Emily left with Susan and Carla, but not before giving Ted a big smile. As he watched them walk away, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He'd done something right in a world often laced with injustices. He'd offered a little girl the chance to escape unthinkable cruelty. And in turn, she taught him about bravery he had never known he possessed. That year, as Emily continued her life with the Whitfields, Ted found himself increasingly involved in her journey. He became the trusted adult she could confide in outside her foster family. Sometimes, on a Sunday, he'd pick her up and bring her to the shop for a couple of hours, where she'd quietly read or draw behind the counter while he worked. In the afternoons, they'd walk to the nearby park. She loved the swings, the sense of freedom they gave her. Ted would push her gently, listening to her laughter. One day, she asked him a question that made his heart ache. "Mr. Porter, do you think my mom can see me now? From heaven or wherever she is?" He knelt by her on the swing, the chains rattling softly as she slowed. "I like to think so," he said. "And I think she'd be really proud of you." Emily looked down, her eyes brimming with tears. "I hope so," she whispered. Then she sniffed, trying to be braver than her 10 years could manage. "I'm trying to do better at school, to make her proud." Ted's voice wavered with emotion. "You're a strong, kind-hearted kid, Emily. She'd be proud of you no matter what." In these moments, Ted realized just how deeply he cared for her. It wasn't just pity or obligation. He felt protective, almost paternal. He'd never married, never had children of his own, but something about Emily's resilience, her gentle spirit in the face of unimaginable trauma, moved him to be more than just a bystander. He wanted her to see life as something other than a series of horrible events. As the months went by, their bond only deepened. Emily's foster parents recognized how important Ted was to her emotional healing. He became a fixture at her various events. A small art showcase at her school, a short performance during a holiday concert. Each time, she'd look for him in the crowd with a hopeful smile, and each time, his presence would fill her with reassurance that she was not alone. Despite her progress, nightmares occasionally haunted her. She confided in Ted about them, how she'd dream of a pounding on her bedroom door, or see Greg's face twisted in anger. "I wake up and my heart is beating so fast," she told Ted once, while they walked near a pond in the local park. "Then I remember he's in prison. But I can't shake the feeling he's coming back." Ted listened, offering gentle reassurance. The two of them sat on a bench, watching ducks glide across the water. "When that happens," he said, "try to remember where you really are. You're in your new home, with people who care about you. And you can always call me if you need to talk." She looked up, giving a small nod. "Okay." Then came the day that everyone believed would stay a nightmare forever but never again become reality. Greg Dawson escaped prison. The news broke in the middle of a Saturday. Ted learned about it from a frantic phone call by Carla Perez. He somehow managed to slip out during a work detail, she reported breathlessly. We don't know if he had outside help. The authorities are on high alert. Emily's foster family has police stationed outside the house. Ted felt his blood run cold. How did this happen? It's unclear, Carla answered, panic evident in her tone. But you need to know. If he's vindictive, he might come after Emily, or anyone who helped put him away. Ted recalled Officer Morales's words from so long ago, keep your ears open. If Greg returns to town, there's a chance he might try to track down anyone who helped Emily. Ted closed his eyes, forcing himself to stay calm. Carla, please tell me Emily's safe. She's at the Whitfields, right? Surrounded by police? Yes, Carla said. But we're all worried. I'll keep you updated. Ted hung up, feeling an all-too-familiar dread seize his chest. After the murder, the trial, and the sentencing, how could this happen? He paced around his shop, uncertain if he should close up and drive to the Whitfields' home, or if that would just add to the chaos. Eventually, he decided to remain where he was, phone in hand, in case Emily or the police needed to reach him. Every ring of the phone, every passing car outside, made his heart jump. Hours crawled by. The local news confirmed the prison break. A statewide manhunt was underway. Ted dreaded the possibilities swirling through his mind. Greg might lie low, or he might be single-minded in seeking revenge. The latter seemed more likely, given the hatred he'd shown in court. Ted locked up early, double-checking every window, every door. Night fell. Ted slept fitfully, jerking awake at every small sound from the street below. But no call came. No knock on the door. By morning, no further developments were announced, except that the search continued. A tense hush fell over Brookhaven. For 2 days, Emily's home remained under strict police watch, officers rotating shifts on the perimeter. The Whitfields kept Emily indoors, away from the windows, not allowing her to attend school. The entire family was terrified. Ted called every few hours, speaking with Susan or Carla, who assured him that Emily was coping but terrified. Susan's voice often trembled over the line, confessing that Emily wouldn't let go of her hand and needed constant reassurance. On the third night after Greg's escape, lightning streaked across a stormy sky, illuminating the streets in sharp bursts. Rain hammered against the rooftops, wind howling through the alleyways. Sometime past midnight, the phone in Ted's bedroom rang, jolting him from a half-conscious doze. His heart seized. He lunged for the receiver, dread twisting in his gut. It was Carla, her voice frantic. Greg got past the police guard. Emily is gone. He took her. Ted nearly dropped the phone. What do you mean, gone? How? Where were the police? He must have found a blind spot or timed it perfectly. Susan and Jim woke to a shattered window. Emily's bed was empty. There was a struggle. One officer is injured but alive. We think Greg forced Emily out at gunpoint. Ted, we don't know where they are. Terror surged through Ted, leaving him dizzy. Did anyone see what direction they went? A car. No one knows yet. The FBI is stepping in, searching. But Emily, she's out there in the middle of this storm with him. Ted struggled to breathe. What can I do? Carla's voice trembled with anguish. Just stay by the phone. If Emily can, she might call you. The authorities will keep you in the loop. That's all we can do right now. Ted hung up, stunned. His worst fears had come to pass. Emily, abducted in the dead of night, at the mercy of a man who had already proven himself a murderer. Rage and helplessness churned in Ted's chest. He prayed Emily would find some way to escape, to hold out until help arrived. The next 2 days stretched into a waking nightmare for the entire town. The police and FBI agents fanned out in a massive search, combing highways, rest stops, abandoned buildings, and forested back road. The weather had turned from storms to sweltering heat, compounding the misery. Ted's phone rang incessantly with questions from investigators, from Carla, from Susan, all hoping someone had heard something, anything. Ted barely slept, barely ate. He replayed every memory of Emily in his mind, racking his brain for clues. Did she ever mention a place her father used to talk about? A cabin or a friend's property? But Emily had always been tight-lipped about her father's world, having spent most of her time locked in fear at home. By the morning of the third day, rumors of sightings trickled in. A gas station attendant thought he recognized Greg from the wanted posters. Someone else reported seeing a man and a frightened-looking child near an old truck. Leads sprang up, only to evaporate under scrutiny. The sense of desperation soared. Then came a breakthrough. The FBI located a remote cabin registered in Greg's deceased uncle's name, deep in the wooded hills about 50 miles north of Brookhaven. Footprints were found outside, along with fresh tire tracks. A perimeter was established, and news reached Ted through Officer Morales, who assured him that a specialized unit was moving in. "He's in there with her," Morales said grimly. "We've established visual confirmation of a child inside." Ted's mind whirled, torn between relief and horror. Emily was alive but held captive. The cabin stood near a winding dirt road, with thick pines and rocky outcroppings. A standoff was likely. "We're going to try negotiation first," Morales added. "Greg's not responding well, though." Ted closed his eyes, imagining Emily trapped in that small, isolated space, forced to face her father's rage. He paced his apartment, phone pressed to his ear. "Please, let me come there. I understand how you feel," Morales said gently, "but stay where you are. We have a protocol. We don't want bystanders near a potentially volatile scene." Ted reluctantly agreed, hanging up with a trembling hand. For the next few hours, he stared at the phone, bracing for the worst, hoping for the best. His mind conjured images of Emily, bound or threatened at gunpoint, and he nearly broke down. Late afternoon bled into evening when the call finally came. Morales's voice was breathy, laced with adrenaline. "They moved in," she said. "Greg refused to surrender. Shots were fired. He's dead." Ted hardly dared to speak. "And Emily?" "She's alive," Morales confirmed. "She's safe. Shaken up, but physically unharmed. An FBI agent has her. They're taking her to the hospital for a checkup." Relief burst through Ted in a wave so powerful, he had to sink into a chair to keep from falling. Tears blurred his vision. "Thank God," he murmured. "Thank God." Ted didn't wait for an invitation. Early the next morning, he drove straight to the hospital where Emily had been admitted for observation. He found Carla Perez pacing the waiting room, the lines of worry on her face softened by a hint of relief. She spotted Ted and waved him over. "She's okay," Carla said, leading him down a hallway to a private room. "Mostly shock, exhaustion, dehydration. No serious injuries." Ted stepped inside and saw Emily in a hospital bed, an IV drip in her arm, dark circles under her eyes. She turned her head, spotting him. "Mr. Porter," she whispered, voice quavering. Tears slid down her cheeks. He hurried to her side, gently taking her hand in both of his. "Emily," he said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore." Emily's grip was surprisingly strong for her small hand. I was so scared," she admitted, her face crumpling. "He said he was going to make me pay for talking to the police, for telling everyone about him. He wouldn't let me sleep and her voice caught in her throat. Ted smoothed her hair back from her forehead, trying to keep his own tears at bay. "It's over," he said gently. "He's gone. He can't come back. He'll never hurt you again." She released a pent-up sob, and Ted wrapped an arm around her, cautious not to dislodge the IV. For a long moment she just cried, and Ted held her, murmuring soft reassurances. Eventually, her sobs subsided into tired sniffles. Carla stood by, offering a comforting presence. "I'm sorry for crying so much," Emily said, wiping her eyes on the hospital's scratchy sheet. "You have nothing to apologize for," Ted replied, voice firm but tender. "You've been through more than anyone should ever have to face." A gentle knock on the door signaled the arrival of Susan and Jim Whitfield, Emily's foster parents. They rushed to her side, their own relief palpable. Susan stroked Emily's hair, tears streaming down her face as well. Jim stood quietly, his broad shoulders shaking with the weight of what they had nearly lost. In the days after Greg Dawson's death, the media recounted the story, how a violent criminal had escaped prison, abducted his own child, and been killed in a standoff. Most of Brookhaven responded with a mixture of shock and relief. Once again, headlines rippled through local news, and townsfolk discussed it in subdued voices at the grocery store, the diner, and on front porches. Ted visited Emily every day during her hospital stay, bringing small gifts, a stuffed bear, a packet of watercolor pencils, a new sketchpad. He spoke softly with her whenever she woke from restless sleep, reminding her that everything was going to be all right. Even after her release, the trauma lingered. Emily wrestled with flashbacks. She would go quiet at sudden noises, her eyes darting around as if expecting her father to lunge from the shadows. She insisted on keeping every door locked at night. Therapy sessions increased in frequency. But bit by bit, with unwavering support from the Whitfields, Carla, and Ted, Emily began to heal again. She threw herself into her art, producing paintings both bright and dark, flowers blooming in fields of black, sunsets overshadowed by menacing silhouettes that eventually dissolved into radiant light. Ted helped her set up a small display in his shop, dedicating a corner to local artists and giving Emily the spotlight. She smiled shyly when customers complimented her work. One day, she stood in the shop with Ted, gazing at her paintings, and said, "It's like I'm painting my way out of a nightmare." Ted nodded, feeling pride swell in his chest. "You're doing more than that. You're showing anyone else in a dark place that there's hope on the other side." Time passed, and with Greg Dawson no longer a looming threat, Emily's life continued on a path toward stability. She stayed with the Whitfields, who fell in love with her gentle spirit. Ted watched from the sidelines as adoption proceedings began. While it was bittersweet, Emily had lost her mother so tragically. This new family represented a true home, something she had never really experienced before. The day the adoption went through, Emily asked Ted if he would come to the courthouse. He arrived in his best suit, awkwardly adjusting his tie. When the judge announced the adoption final, Emily beamed, and Susan and Jim pulled her into a hug. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment. In the midst of it all, Emily reached out and tugged Ted close, making him part of the family photo. Afterward, they all went to a small celebratory lunch. Emily sat next to Ted, picking at her food in excited nervousness. "I guess this is my forever home now," she said softly. He gave her a smile, voice brimming with affection. "You deserve it, Emily." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "You've been there since the beginning. Thanks for never giving up on me." He felt emotion tighten his throat. "I never will." Seasons turned. A year after Greg's escape and subsequent death, Emily stood in front of Ted's shop window, painting a mural for a local festival. She was 12 now, taller, her features more assured. The festival theme was unity and community healing, and Emily's mural depicted a bright sunrise over a small, bustling town, a reflection of Brookhaven itself. People stopped to watch her paint, occasionally offering words of praise. She no longer shrank from attention. She stood tall, her once trembling hands now steady as she sketched bold outlines. Ted admired her from behind the counter, overwhelmed by how far she had come. He remembered the terrified girl who burst into his shop, bruised and pleading. Now, her eyes held a quiet confidence. Every brushstroke seemed to declare, "I survived, and I am still here." That evening, after the festival crowd dispersed, Emily packed up her brushes and joined Ted inside. He had stayed open late, allowing stragglers to browse. She waited patiently as he served the last customer of the day, an elderly man purchasing a jar of homemade peach jam. Once the customer left, Emily spoke up. "Ted," she said, calling him by his first name now and then, "I want to tell you something." He locked the cash register, turning to her. "Sure. Everything okay?" She stepped closer, setting down her paint kit. I still have nightmares sometimes. I dream about being in that cabin, hearing his voice, feeling so hopeless. But then, in the dream, a door opens, and I hear your voice calling me, telling me it's safe. I follow it, and I wake up before anything bad happens. Ted's eyes stum with tears he fought to keep at bay. He inhaled, steadying himself. I'm glad I can be there for you, he said softly. Even if it's just a dream. Emily reached out to hug him. You're there for me in real life, too? He gently returned the hug. The warmth of that moment enveloped him, a tangible reminder that sometimes, in a world fraught with unspeakable cruelty, kindness and compassion could still prevail. Outside, the neon open sign reflected on wet pavement, a light drizzle having begun. Emily stepped back and grinned, glancing at her watch. It's almost 9, she said. Susan will be waiting. I'll walk you to the car, Ted replied. They parked in the lot across the street, right? She nodded, gathering her art supplies. Together, they stepped outside under the shop's awning. Susan waved from across the way. Emily turned to Ted, a smile glowing on her face despite the raindrops splattering on her jacket. Thank you for letting me paint the mural, she said. It helps me feel free. He returned her smile. Thank you for reminding me what courage looks like. They exchanged a soft goodbye, and Emily dashed across the street, climbing into the back seat of the Whitfields' car. She gave a last wave through the window as they drove away. Ted stood under the awning, watching the taillights fade into the drizzle. A reflection of the mural in his window made him pause. The painted sunrise was luminous, full of hope. She's going to be all right, he told himself. He believed it with all his heart. In the months that followed, Emily continued her therapy. She still felt the ripple effects of trauma, but each day carried her further away from her father's shadow. No longer paralyzed by the dread of him returning, she flourished in her art, her friendships, and her new family. The memory of Rachel remained a tender wound, but Emily found ways to honor her mother, hanging pictures of her in her new bedroom, talking about the good memories. Ted watched her evolve with a mixture of pride and humility. Sometimes, he questioned how he, a quiet shopkeeper who had always believed himself to be rather unremarkable, ended up at the center of such a profound journey. The answer lay in something simple and profound: compassion. It wasn't about heroics or grand gestures. It was about being there when someone was alone and frightened, about offering a hand when the rest of the world seemed to look away. Nearly 2 years after that fateful day when Emily ran into Ted's shop, the local community center held an art exhibition for young talent. Emily was one of the featured artists. Her collection told a silent story of darkness and light, of sorrow and triumph. One particular painting drew a crowd. It showed a small girl in silhouette, standing before a towering monster shaped like a man, her hand reaching out to grasp the hand of a figure in the background. The figure's face was obscured, but the posture was protective. Bright rays of color exploded from this touch, banishing the shadows. Ted stood beside Emily as visitors admired her work. She said little, but her eyes spoke volumes. Susan and Jim hovered nearby, beaming with pride. Carla Perez was in attendance, too, dabbing at tears as she saw the progression of Emily's paintings. Later that evening, a local journalist approached Emily, asking if she could take a few photos and perhaps get a brief statement. Emily hesitated, glancing at Ted for reassurance. He gave her a small nod, and she took a deep breath, turning to the reporter. "It's about finding hope," she said, voice clear and steady. "Even when bad things happen, there can still be good people, good moments that help you keep going." Ted blinked back tears, awed by her poise. The reporter asked if there was anyone she wanted to thank for her journey so far. Emily's eyes flicked to Ted, then to Susan and Jim, and finally to Carla. "I want to thank everyone who helped me see that I deserved a better life. Especially Mr. Porter. He was there on the worst day, and he never left." After the interview, Ted found himself swallowing a lump in his throat yet again. Emily came over and hugged him. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head. You're the one who found the courage to speak up, Emily. Don't ever forget that. She just smiled, a warmth in her expression that outshone any darkness in her memories. Years down the line, Emily would stand at a new threshold, perhaps her first day at a specialized arts high school, perhaps even the cusp of college, if she chose that path. The nightmares would fade further. The echoes of Greg Dawson would dull. But the scars, both emotional and physical, would remain as part of her story. Yet they would not define her. They would serve only as evidence of how far she had come, and how powerful the human spirit could be in the face of adversity. And Ted Porter would remain in her life, the steadfast presence she had once feared she could never find. A quiet man with a gentle smile, who had opened his heart and his shop to a frightened little girl. Each year, on the anniversary of her rescue, they would share a cup of tea and reflect on the journey that took them from terror to triumph. Because in the end, their bond transcended a mere act of kindness. It was a testament to the resilience of a child's hope and the unwavering strength of genuine compassion. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.